As far as war games go, skirmish games are some of my favorite ones out there. Lower model counts mean it costs less money to get into the games, and there's fewer models to paint. But more importantly, I think the smaller model counts means that there's more of a focus on the character of the individual models. In a mass battles game, most units in your army don't have any kind of identity, they're just soldiers in the rank and file. But when you have a small crew of 6 to 8 guys, each of them probably has a name and a whole backstory. On top of all that, skirmish games tend to play a little bit faster, and I find that they usually allow for a little more tactical play, so you feel like you're really influencing the outcome of the games, instead of just smashing your armies into each other and rolling dice. So in light of all that, let's talk about my 5 favorite skirmish games in no particular order. And while we're at it, drop a comment below and let me know what your favorite skirmish game is. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and the Discord will be linked below if you want to join up and have a conversation over there. There'll also be a link to the Patreon, so if you want to join up and kick in a couple dollars to support the channel, that'd be awesome. But now let's get into the games. Corvus Belli's Infinity is a game that I really wish I played more of, and I'm working on doing just that. A couple things about this game really stand out to me. First, I think Infinity models are probably the best quality on the market, at least that I've seen. They make really gorgeous models, super high detail, and some pretty unique and interesting sculpts. They are metal, which can be a little bit annoying if you're not used to it, but once you get past that, it's really worth it. And frankly, pictures can't really do these models justice. You gotta get some of them in your hand. They're also a really unique painting project, because there's a lot of heavily armored models, so it can be a lot different to paint if you're used to painting more organic models. Speaking of, the setting for Infinity is really cool. While it originally had a very anime aesthetic, they've sort of moved away from that a bit more recently, and now it's sort of got a style of its own. It's set in the future, where humans have colonized different planets, and now different nations and factions fight amongst each other for power. There's also some hostile aliens that are coming to try to wipe us out, and that leads to some pretty interesting stories. There's some pretty high-tech stuff in the game, and I wouldn't call it hard sci-fi, because they don't strictly stick to known science, but it also doesn't get too crazy. I would compare it to something like Halo, in terms of how the technology works. Definitely well past our current understanding, but it doesn't get into the realm where everything kind of feels like magic, which I think is a good thing. Probably the best thing about Infinity is the game system. It's super unique and has a lot of really interesting mechanics that makes the game feel a lot different from anything else you've probably played before. First off, it uses D20s, like we're playing Dungeons & Dragons or something. Possibly my favorite thing about it is that when you're rolling for a check, you want to roll under your stat for that ability. But if the dice roll is contested, then you still want to roll higher than your opponent. In that way, the game avoids the sort of counterintuitive thing that you see in a lot of other games, where a lower stat is better. But when you're in a face-to-face roll, you're still looking for the higher roll. I think it's a really good system. It can be a little weird if you're used to games like Warhammer, but once you get used to it, it flows really well and it makes a lot of sense to me. The other really awesome thing about Infinity is the ARO system. Unlike most skirmish games, Infinity has an I go you go system, meaning that one player activates their whole army, and then the other player does the same. But AROs allow you to respond to what your opponent's doing, to try to foil their plans while they're activating their army. This makes the game feel really dynamic, and it means that you don't have that problem, where when your opponent's going, you feel like you can just walk away from the table and go make a sandwich or something. It keeps the players tuned into the game, and it means that you have to be thinking tactically, even when your opponent's going. But probably my favorite thing about Infinity are the tags. Big heckin' mechs. Now I bet a lot of you are just like me, where there's a short list of things that if any game has them, it immediately makes you interested in that game. For some people it's dwarves, for some people it's zombies. For me, one of those things is big robots. And Infinity has some of the coolest and most interestingly designed mechs and robots that I've ever seen. Basically every faction has a bunch of remotes, which are little robots that can scurry around the battlefield and get up to all sorts of shenanigans. And in addition, you can sink a lot of your points into a tag, which can then basically be a one-man army and rampage through your opponent's models. I love them, and frankly, even if I didn't play Infinity, I'd probably buy a bunch of these tags, just to have the models. If you've never checked out Infinity, just like most skirmish games, you can get into it for well under $100. And of all the games on this list, Infinity is probably the most popular, so it's more than likely that there's a scene in your area, and I would encourage you to reach out and ask for a demo game. Infinity has a reputation for being pretty complicated, but the community is really great, and I'm sure there are folks out there who'd be happy to help you get started. Carnevale is set in the 18th century after a magical anomaly known as the Rent appears in the sky over the Vatican and causes widespread destruction. The city of Venice, however, is spared, but in the fallout from the Rent, it becomes overrun with fish-like creatures known as the Rashar, vampires under Vlad Dracula himself, psychopathic and murderous nobles, an evil syndicate known as the Guild, and many other horrors. The Rent has spread madness, but also magic throughout the city, and the different factions compete for power and struggle to survive. The miniatures for Carnevale are made of resin and come in a wide variety of interesting characters, from plague doctors and street performers, to walking sharks and killer crabs, to, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions about this guy. My personal favorite are a group of the doctors who use magic to mind control different animals and force them to do their bidding. The game system for Carnevale is very interesting. It's pretty light on rules, which makes it easy to jump in and get started. It's based on D10s, and most ability checks require you to hit a 7 or higher. Your model's stats determine the number of dice you'll roll to try to hit those 7s, which is a good system because one die roll can be pretty fickle, but rolling a small pool will tend to bring you more towards the statistical average. In addition, one die in every pool will be unique, called the fate die, and if it rolls a 10 in addition to any other success, you score a critical, but if it rolls a 1 and you have no other successes, you've made a fumble. This can lead to interesting results and cinematic moments, and overall the rule set lends itself to narrative gameplay. There's even a rule called Fortune's Favor that allows you to reward your opponent for pulling off a particularly dramatic feat. There's also a particularly interesting magic system where mages get access to one or more magical disciplines that allow them to access a pool of magical abilities. But by far my favorite part of the system is the way that movement and terrain works. In most games, terrain is simply an obstacle, a problem that you have to work around to try to accomplish your objectives. In Carnevale, the terrain is more like a resource that you can climb up, jump onto, or pounce off of. You can chain jumps by jumping onto a piece of terrain and then back off it on the other side, giving you the ability to increase the distance you can move. Or you can climb up on top of a building and then jump off it into melee combat, making your attack even more powerful. All of this makes the system feel really free-flowing, and it can be a ton of fun just to move across the board. The game is played on a table with lots of buildings and canals and waterways because, Venice. This means that there's rules for swimming and diving, and you can even try to drown your unsuspecting opponent if they're not good in the water. This next game checks a lot of boxes for me. It's a post-apocalypse where civilization has collapsed and the world is partially flooded and covered with thick jungle. It's got cool, cobbled together and scavenged tech from the old civilizations, and it's got anthropomorphic animals that look pretty badass. But in addition to all that, one of the things that's at the top of my list, right along with big robots, is dinosaurs. And this game also has dinosaurs. The Drowned Earth is set in a world a few hundred years after something called the Event happened. It upset the ecosystem, causing global warming and flooding. Now, no one remembers what even happened, but humans, intelligent gorilla-like creatures called Barengi, as well as many other species of intelligent animals, are all living in the husk of this ruined civilization. New empires have arisen, and many people spend their time in the ruins of the old civilization, digging for technology and secrets. Different organizations have sprung up in pursuit of finding these treasures, and needless to say, conflict has resulted. All of this in the backdrop of a world inhabited by dinosaurs, some of which have been successfully trained to work alongside the humans and other species. One of the most interesting things about this game is that the factions are not organized by species, but rather by common goals and allegiances, and as a result, each of the factions has a variety of species available to it. On top of that, you can also hire the various dinosaur species, who operate like mercenaries. The setting of the game is what first drew my attention, and the post-apocalyptic world reminds me a bit of Horizon Zero Dawn. Along those same lines, the game is best played on a table that's partially covered in water, and the theme and setting lend themselves to some really interesting and unique tables covered in plants and ruined buildings. The game system is really interesting, as it uses only a handful of D10s. On most die rolls, you'll roll an attribute die and a feat die, trying to get under a particular stat. If you make it with the attribute die, you pass. If you also make it with the feat die, you nail it. And if you roll a unique symbol on the feat die, then you've achieved a feat. These multiple tiers of success contribute to exciting gameplay, and the system is also used to attempt dynamic movement, allowing you to leap and climb to traverse the terrain-filled board. There's also a reaction system, which allows you to interrupt your opponent's activation to do an action of your own. For this and other reasons, as you might have already guessed, this game is often compared to Infinity, but unlike Infinity, it uses alternate activations. To make this work, reactions actually use action points from your unactivated models, and an interesting aspect of the system is that when activating a model, you can leave some of their action points unused, so you'll have an opportunity to react on your opponent's future activations. This is a game that I don't have that much experience with yet, but the promise of being able to use a Utah Raptor to leap across a crumbling and overgrown building has me excited to get some games in. Bushido is a game set in a fantasy version of Japan known as the Jwar Islands. The prefecture of Ryu has come to power, but they still have many enemies who challenge them, including rival clans, cultists, and even more mysterious and sinister enemies. We're all probably used to seeing fictional fantasy versions of Europe, but it's cool to see a take on that concept in a different part of the world. As a result, the models in the game take heavy influence from Japanese history and mythology, and you can find samurai and ashigaru who look like they might be out of a historical game, as well as ninjas, bird-like creatures known as tengu, seafaring pirates, as well as a faction full of mythological demons known as the Savage Wave. These models rival Infinity in their quality, and in particular, I find that the swords and other weapons are sculpted and casted excellently, so they come out looking gorgeous on the models. Oh, and did I mention the combat bears? There's a whole faction that worships bears, called the Minamoto clan, and you can hire this big boy into the game. So, pretty awesome. Bushido's another game that has a really interesting dice mechanic that feels totally different than most other games. When you have to roll for a test, you roll your pool of dice and then discard any ones. You then take the highest result and you get +1 to that result for every other non-1 result you got, up to 2, and that becomes your total. It sounds a little complicated, but it's really easy once you actually give it a shot. And the result of this is that most of your dice rolls are going to tend to be somewhere near an expected value based on the number of dice you roll. There's still some randomness, but it's going to be very improbable for you to roll a super low number, as long as you have a few dice in the pool. In my opinion, this feels very thematic, because anybody who'd be participating in a battle like this is going to have a certain baseline level of skill. There's nothing worse than when you're playing a game, and your highly trained swordsman goes to make an attack, rolls a 1, and basically drops his sword on the ground. Seems kind of silly. Easily the coolest part of Bushido's game system is how melee combat works. In most games, when you attack someone in melee, they roll for their defense or armor saves, but are otherwise passive in the combat. In Bushido, combat plays out like a duel, where both players have the opportunity to attack and defend. When combat is initiated, both players form their dice pool, and then secretly decide how many to allocate towards attack and how many towards defense. This is a really interesting example of a well-designed game mechanic that really adds to the theme and the feel of the game, because it really gives you the sense that you're dueling in a sword fight. Depending on how you decide to spend your dice, the attacking model might end up taking more damage than the defender. In addition to that, when a model is attacked in melee, they lose an action point for the turn, and if they're attacked multiple times, they'll start to suffer penalties. In this way, a stronger model can be taken down by multiple weaker attackers, and it's unlikely that you'll have a situation where one super powerful model is able to tank for their whole army. Another fairly rare mechanic in Bushido is that facing matters, and if you position your models poorly, your opponent will have the opportunity to sneak up behind you and punish you severely. Bushido's played on a 2x2 table, smaller than most games, which makes it easy to build interesting and thematic tables to go along with the setting. If you've ever watched my channel before, then you had to know that Malifaux was going to make this list. I think Skirmish Games are a really interesting design space, and they allow the rules writers to get creative and come up with interesting new systems. And I think Malifaux is probably the best example of that, because the game runs with no dice at all. Instead of rolling, you actually flip cards off of a deck, called a fate deck, to determine random results in the game. This one change makes the game feel totally different than any other games you've played, and it also fundamentally changes the way that random results work in the game. When you roll a die, you get a theoretically random result, and that has no effect on any of the future results if you roll the die again. Because of that, even though it's statistically improbable, you could theoretically just roll terrible results for a whole game. I'm sure we've all had that feeling when we finished a game, where we felt like it all went wrong because our dice betrayed us. Most of the time that's probably not true, but sometimes it is. In Malifaux, because you're flipping cards off a deck, every time you flip a low card, that card gets removed from the deck and is taken out of the pool of cards that you're going to flip next time. As a result, for every 1 and 2 you flip, you'll eventually also flip a 12 or a 13. And in addition to all that, it adds another element to the strategy, because considering what cards have already been flipped and what cards are left in your deck can have a major effect on the tactical decisions you make while playing. In addition, every player starts with a hand of cards that they can use to cheat in as their result, to try to guarantee that certain abilities or actions go through. All of these things together make Malifaux feel super tactical and competitive, and it's rare that you'll ever lose a game and feel like it was all based on luck. The miniatures for Malifaux are really gorgeous, and they come in a crazy variety. Everything from gothic horror, to Wild West, to steampunk, to monsters from mythology. The characters are all super diverse, and there's people from lots of different backgrounds, and tons of women. Malifaux models have a reputation for being difficult to assemble, especially because they're in true scale, meaning that the bodies are proportioned like real humans, as opposed to the heroic scale we often see, where the heads and hands are much bigger than they should be. I, for one, think this is a good thing, because it makes the models look more realistic, even if it makes them a little fiddly and harder to paint. The lore for Malifaux is super interesting. It's an alternate history set in the early 1900s, and it mostly takes place in another dimension through a breach in space-time called Malifaux. If you want to learn more, I have dozens of videos on my channel covering all aspects of the lore. There's tons of really interesting characters, and one of my favorite things about them is that the writers usually base the characters on some element of a familiar trope, but then they remix and add to that trope to make them feel unique and interesting. As a result, many of the characters feel somewhat familiar when you first look at them, but they're not just carbon copies of other characters that have already been done before. A good example of this would be Seamus, who combines the Mad Hatter and slasher villain tropes, but he's also a whoremonger who's followed around by a harem of undead prostitutes, and has the voice of an evil god in his head who's trying to convince him to destroy the world. Not all the characters are that off the wall, but you sort of get what I mean here. So those are all my favorites, again, in no particular order. I think a lot of these games tend to get overlooked, especially in a market where there's some really popular games that overshadow a lot of the others. But the cool thing about all these is they're really easy to get into. Not only are they all pretty inexpensive, but they even have free rules available on their website for each of the 5. I'll put a link to them in the description below, so you can check them out for yourself. Even if you had to buy 2 crews for any of these games, so you'd have stuff available to try to teach a friend to play, you're still only looking at about $100, and you'll have 2 full crews ready to go on the table. But if you don't want to buy into them, then the best way to go would be to reach out to your local community and see if there's anybody else already playing them. As I've said, most people in the hobby are really welcoming, and if you express interest in the game they love, they'll probably be more than happy to help you out in any way they can. So don't hesitate to put out some feelers, because it'll definitely be worth it. But drop me a comment and let us all know what you think of these 5 games, and if there's another skirmish game that you like that I didn't put on the list. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe, and there'll be links to the Discord and the Patreon in case you want to check those out, and thanks for watching.